So this is actually going to be a very short session again. This one inspired by a conversation I had with a mentor of mine, and the conversation around what it is that makes actually what we do at IDEA different than the norm, and certainly than those kind of grey-suited McKinsey type approaches to what we do. Partly inspired here by one of my favorite books. This is like two business books that I'd recommend to everyone to read instantly. This is one, Guy Kawasaki's Rules for Revolutionaries. The other is Ed Catmull's Creativity Inc. This is like Guy Kawasaki's first album. It's the one where all the great stuff really went into this book. So if you think of yourself like a revolutionary, the idea of create like a god, command like a king, and work like a slave is phenomenal, and prescient actually. For what came after. He worked at Apple when he conceived of this book. So I've got 5, and just going to run through them quickly. Would invite you to comment and to have a dialogue about them, of course. I'm going to focus on some of what it is that makes IDEA different, some of the ways that we think about strategy differently, and some of the ways that we'd expect to see good things happen as a result of embracing this kind of an approach to strategy instead of the traditional view. The first one actually seems very obvious, and people say it a lot, but actually they rarely then go on to execute on it. And the first rule at IDEA is that there's no I in IDEA. First thing that happens is people say, well, yes, there's one at the front. But you get to that point where no one at IDEA does anything by themselves. It doesn't matter whether you've got 30 years worth of experience, or you've got PhDs and MSCs and you've got Nobel Prizes. No one does anything alone. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that you need the tension of somebody else to explain your working out, to test your assumptions, to challenge your thinking on the way through. So that idea that there's no I in ideas, people are told not to say I think, because I think, to a client at least, means you've got the benefit of my thinking, which, if you're Bain or you're McKinsey and you're priding yourself on how smart your folks are, and you go, well, that's fine, but I'm then going to have to take it on trust that you're really smart in many cases. One thing that we do at IDEA is we have this kind of lack of pretension. So the folks, will continue to challenge everyone's thoughts. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter how many times they've done what they're doing before. They have to be open to explaining and to being challenged on the assumptions that they've made and the what ifs and the so whats of that conversation. And I think that's quite critical. That you don't know what's useful to somebody else until you share it with them. So you have to be open to sharing a lot of what you think and the reasons why you think that, to get to the point of being able to share, because you don't know what someone else might think is phenomenally exciting. And this is one of the problems that we have with this multidisciplinary approach, which is often that it's a sort of stitched together quilt rather than an interdisciplinary view. So if a clinician has to say to a commercial guy, I believe X, they have to also be interested in listening to the commercial guy's view of saying, well, actually, I believe Y, and let's have a conversation about reconciling the difference. And there's something that's part of our sort of view of this, which is that there's also a line that we use a lot. So without a plan, 10 men can see no further than one. So if you imagine a team all lined up looking into the distance, you're really enabled by the person who can see furthest, and that's often the way that teams behave. But if you give them a plan, you say, well, look, you're going to go over here and do X, and you're going to go and do here and do Y, and then suddenly that team can see further. They can stand on the shoulders of each other, or see, whatever it is. But with a plan, 10 men can see further than one. And that is actually the way that we like to think about imagination and to think about possibility with a plan that people have gone to different places and seen different things. So that first one, there's no I in IDEA, is fundamental to the way that we work internally. Another thing that's always been key has been the idea of inductive versus deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning says, I'm going to do put everything on the desk, I'm going to read through it, and I'm going to come up with a therefore. IDEA does do that, obviously, because we need to come up with a therefore from what we've seen. But the most important part of how we do what we do is the inductive part, which is to say, well, what if what if we did this thing that isn't in the paper, but what if we did this? Because that step that you just took is an important step. It means that we're not just going to get the best of what we've seen, but we might get the best of something that we haven't seen. And actually that perspective on what might be instead of what is often very helpful, because we're creating new worlds for a lot of people that we're talking to. Sometimes we need to use different language, sometimes we need to use different ways of seeing things or different stories, or actually imagine different possibilities in path to market. So that inductive creative step isn't the same as the analytical deductive step that often tends to lead to, deductive analytical thinking, that kind of McKinsey-like, we've seen everything, we've looked at everything, and here's the answer. Well, what if the answer wasn't in the stuff that you're looking at? So inductive versus deductive, I think, is incredibly critical to the way that we work too. And something that is covered in here, and he uses this wonderful phrase in here: eat like a bird, eat like a bird, poop like an elephant. And this is about reading everything. And one of the things that, and I would recommend you read the book for why it's eat like a bird and poop like an elephant, because it's surprising that it's that way around. But one thing that we're very aware of when we start working is that there's so much to read. You look at oncology, and then you're suddenly reading Atul Gawande, and you're reading, Sid Mukherjee, and there's a lot to read to immerse yourself quickly. But it's not just reading; it's also TV, it's YouTube, it's Twitter, where people will give you experiences for free, in order that not just that you can distill it, like the previous comment around induction versus deduction, but so that you can come up with what ifs and hypotheses about the way that things work. And it doesn't matter when you fixed your knowledge, it doesn't matter whether you went to medical school and graduated last year or 20 years ago, or whether you learned about marketing, this year or 20 years ago. There's always something new to discover, and at IDEA, all of our books are free, so we pay for any book someone might want to read, and it doesn't matter whether it's on subject or off subject. Some of the most inspiring stuff comes from reading engineering books or whatever. But that's also critical to us, is that we're always looking for new sources of inspiration, new ways to think about things, ways that other industries approach problems, and that our industry could too. And I guess if you're watching this video, you're probably already in the right mindset anyway. But you have to recognize you're already in a very small segment of our industry, which actually is interested in self-improvement. That constant curiosity, that constant search for self-improvement is absolutely part of why you're going to be better at doing your job than the vast majority of the folks in this space. And taking a step over to the fourth one, the idea of is actually very straightforward. Don't behave as if your drug is average if you don't want it to be. And I touched on this in the last live stream, but a lot of the industry is set up to say, look, what do drugs on average do? How much do drugs on average cost to develop? How much time on average do you spend before launch to put a plan in place? That's all fine if you want your drug to be an average drug, but on my experience is no one does actually want that. What they want is that their drug is outstanding or first or best or whatever it is in its class. So this, I've never understood this idea of averaging everything out and starting to say, look, there, it tells you something. Actually, it doesn't tell you anything. It tells you on average what drugs tend to do on average, but it doesn't tell you how to outlie that population. So that kind of floor of averages is absolutely critical. We publish as much as anyone else that it's costing a lot of money to develop drugs if you look at R&D divided by numbers of approvals. But that's heterogeneous. There's a curve that looks very different for the people who spent a lot to get to market and people that spent a little. So which average do you want to pick? It doesn't have to cost a lot. It could cost a little, but actually the average is the problem. So as soon as you start thinking about, well, this one drug that I have, how am I going to get it to market? The averages don't always tell you very much. Same thing actually when you're looking at clinical trial work as well. Sometimes we've seen that the beauty is not in the average, but it's in the outliers, it's in the subpopulations, it's in the median instead of in the mean, and those kind of things are very critical to the way that we think. The fifth thing, which is probably linked to that, is that we like to challenge every definition that we're given. And it's not just because we're awkward. It's because actually there's a lot of value in challenging definitions. The one that you've seen me talk about before is what innovation means. And it is critical that we discuss what innovation means and what it doesn't mean, because actually a lot of people use it as if it meant everything, all creativity, all kinds of invention, sitting in the same mix. Innovation has a very specific meaning, and when we treat it that way, then we can suddenly start to work with it as a particular discipline. But actually our biggest cheat comes when we start to look at a drug and we say things like, well, what do you mean by efficacy? Because people say, oh, this has got more efficacy than that. And so, well, stop and pause and say, what do you mean by efficacy? Because efficacy means lots of things. It doesn't just mean one thing. You know, efficacy on one scale or on one outcome or on one endpoint, in one population. So as soon as you start breaking it down, you start to see, well, actually, let's say you take an antidepressant, you say, well, are there other things rather than just mood that an antidepressant does? You say, well, okay, suddenly you've got this world full of opportunity where efficacy doesn't just mean effect on mood, but it means, you know, what else that drug might do. And it doesn't matter which therapeutic area that you're in, as soon as you start banning the word efficacy in your conversation, say, well, I want to know what it works on specifically, then you've already got a different place to go. Same thing's true of things like safety, tolerability, but also apply that rule to, you know, when someone says this is the best product in its class, it's best at something, right? It's not just best full stop. So if someone picked up like an iPhone and said this is the best phone in its category, you'd have a lot of people agreeing with you for sure, but actually then it depends what your definition of best is, because for some people that might not be true. So you get a hint in there of, as soon as you start using definitions more tightly, it opens up this world of possibility. So it's not just being awkward, but it's actually looking for, you know, opportunity to improve on dimensions that do matter to people. So that fifth rule is actually about looking under the hood of where everyone starts thinking that they agree with each other, because everyone just says, yeah, it's all about efficacy, this marketplace. In many cases, it's not. So look under the hood a little bit, and suddenly these opportunities start to come out. Or what if we did X, or what if we did Y? Going back to the inductive versus deductive thing. So 5 things that I think help. You know, you think like an ideator, like one of the idea tribe, if you like, the way that we are trying to revolutionize the way people think about strategy. They seem so simple that it didn't seem, like a big step to be talking about them. But of course, they're non-obvious in many cases. So I think what I'll do is I'll write these 5 down. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what else we could have talked about, or whether you think that these 5 are, a special kind of nonsense. So yeah, thank you again for tuning in. It's all appreciated and surprising. So thank you.